Okay, we're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Jerad Alexander. He's just published a book, November 9th, 2021. Really a fascinating book titled Volunteers, Growing Up in the Forever War. And his website is his name, JeradAlexander.com. But this book goes back in detail about his life, kind of in the military family, and he ended up going down that same path, but he can talk more about that. So, Jerad Alexander, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, William. I appreciate this. I thought I'd start with just a little read here.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Audience a little taste of this. All right. Oscar Reich, the Marines are on the move. We are the Devil Dogs, the Leathernecks, the Shock Troops, and the Hard Chargers, all born to kill members of the Suck, the Green Weenie, the Ron Gun Club, the Hardcore, our Corps, the United States Marine Corps. We are modern-era Visigoths with a bigger budget and better armor. Vikings of the Western world, complete with health care and heavy artillery. The Marine Corps is like a high school gym class with guns. And we flash down the highway in western Iraq like a full-court press, rumbling with the menace of our V8 diesels in a long, roaring column of dusty armor, spiked with machine guns and automatic grenade launchers, littered with radios, hunting knives, and cans of high-octane energy drinks. Crosses dangle from our necks, and the nylon bands that wrap our helmets have been marked with our blood types, A positive, O positive, AB positive, in permanent black ink, like sigils for the apothecaries. Snuff and cigarettes sit in our pockets like manna. We can run a hard line back to Seattle and San Diego, the Bronx, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and all the rotting hamlets in central Oklahoma and Nebraska and the Deep South. We've earned GEDs and public school diplomas. We pulled prison time in underfed community colleges and worked off lazy academic hangovers and bloated party schools. We went to class and sat bored through canned lessons on the Monroe Doctrine and Manifest Destiny. We waved the flag. We pledged our allegiance, and so here we are. Maybe we loved you once. We are your friends, your brothers, your sons. We are your fathers and your uncles. We are your husbands and ex-lovers and cheap one-night stands. We hate the Marine Corps, but sometimes we love it too. Hoorah. A large water tower dominates the wasteland like the fat king of a trash-hewn kingdom. It is the last day of summer, and the lieutenant orders the column of 7 Humvees into a laager behind a long berm south of a dusty town tucked into a bend of the Euphrates. We stop and open the Humvee doors. Flies emerge from the dirt beneath us and weave through our cigarette smoke. Rumors breathe into our binoculars and into our thoughts from beyond the berm. Tales of fundamentalism, of stonings and beatings and martyrdom, the fodder of cable news, everything that has become the image of our enemy. I know as I sit here that soon we will have to go into all the towns and cities that carpet the banks of the river like moss and fight and kill all the things that scare us and anger us to make it safe for you thousands of miles away. Better over there than on Main Street, someone has said. And so here we are. And I am here too, in 2005, a U.S. Marine. I have come to Iraq like we have all come, on the back of a million war stories of the past American century, carried forward on the promise of vengeance and the belief in our own exceptionalism. We are Marines and we are Americans, and our mythology is the sun we orbit. Hoorah.
Yeah, so you have those kind of vignettes or stories of your time in the military interspersed between different parts of the book. And can you talk about kind of your background is military in both sides of your family, correct?
It is. You know, my dad was in the U.S. Air Force as he started out as a boom operator, an aerial refueling operator. So what he did is he sat in the back of aerial refueling aircraft, and he fueled jets as they needed fuel when they were transmitting from one place to another and needed to refill midair. And then he became an air traffic controller for some time, and then he got out of the Air Force and went on to do that for until he retired. My mother was also in the Air Force. She was in communications. She started out in active duty and then went into the reserves and got out just before the Persian Gulf War. My stepdad also, he was in the Air Force for 20 years. He retired from the Air Force. He started out in avionics. His job was to maintain the heads-up display in fighter jets, and then he went on to into the intelligence field later. But it even goes further than that. My grandfather on my and every one of my grandparents, all my grandfathers were in the military. My mother's father and stepfather were both in the Air Force. My stepdad's father was in the Army and then Air Force. My dad's father was in the Army. And then there's some trajectories even further that go even back beyond that.
Right. And you wrote in your book, I marked this line: I was locked onto a rail headed only in one direction. It just seemed like it was fated. And you said like you did genealogy and found that there were people even farther back than your grandparents who were military service too, right?
That's right. I'll spare the readers some of the details for their own discovery, but there was some hiccups in my family that sort of interrupted my understanding of this until I was much older, and I eventually learned that my lineage in the military goes really far back, as far as it is perceived to be the American Revolution. In one form or another, there was somebody in my family who was serving in the military.
Right, and I'm sorry. Please continue.
Oh no, that's the basis of that. Yeah.
But I mean, it seemed like your interest in the military, like you tell stories of growing up. You share these stories of kind of capture the flag and all that stuff. It just seemed like there was that draw, and also you had a real interest in the Vietnam War too. Can you talk kind of about your childhood and what your interests were as far as kind of the military?
Sure. It's funny because I think a lot about that. I wonder if it's more than just a connection by virtue of family, because you're right. When I was a kid, I was surrounded by this machinery, and so that certainly was an influence. But there was something a little bit more to it than that. I think there was something sort of ingrained in me that was fascinated with tanks and fighter jets and the people who operated them. I really wanted to know what they did. They were very large in my eye. And then, as a Persian Gulf War effectively just sort of flips a lot of the switches for me, both good and bad, I suppose. And my family had an involvement in that, and I witnessed that and watched that live, like we all kind of did at the period. It was one of the first live televised wars, and then as I became a teenager, Vietnam became a huge interest of mine. I was really interested in the experience of the average soldier. The draftee, or there's somebody who had volunteered for the military for one reason or another and was sent to fight in Vietnam as a private carrying a rifle. Those stories are really interesting to me, and they still kind of are. I'm reading a book now that I remember as a kid seeing around, a book on called Bloods, which is a oral history of African American soldiers in Vietnam. It's fantastic. But yeah, I was really just attracted to the stories of that, and I think in part because it was so tragic. It's almost like a Greek tragedy in a lot of ways. We knew that it was a flawed conflict, and yet we continued it, and it produced results that were deleterious in a lot of a blizzard of ways. So there was that aspect of it too. I think there was a certain tragedy to it that was appealing, but there was also in the face of that, you had people who were doing incredibly brave work, and Vietnam is a remarkably dark conflict. I think of all the wars we fought, it's probably a toss-up in terms of just visceral darkness and ugliness is between the Civil War and Vietnam. But Vietnam, I think, takes the number one, just by how we fought it, just the conditions that we were fighting in, and this are the very ugly ways in which we approached that war. And
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that it was probably one of the most psychologically ambiguous wars of American wars, where we had kind of clear enemies, maybe the Nazis or something, but just like in the atrocities that the Americans inflicted were, and I mean, also the effects psychologically there and at home. I don't think that there wars even in Iraq or Operation Desert Storm had the cataclysmic social effects that Vietnam did.
Right. And you look at the entire period, in fact, I mean, it is a fascinating period from, basically the election of John F. Kennedy all the way to Watergate. I mean, it's, you could sort of look at that as a deconstruction, the first deconstruction rather, of our image as a country, and Vietnam is a corner of that. It's a foundational piece of that. And
I agree with that.
It's such a fascinating period. I love literature from it. It's one of my favorite eras of literature.
Yeah, you mentioned the book Fields of Fire, James Webb's. You watched all those movies and things like that when you were younger. So that you're kind of tied into that. You said your stepdad went to Desert Shield, I think.
He was in Shield and Storm.
Shield and Storm. Right. So there's the attachment to Iraq, right? This family attachment to that area early on, right? So can you kind of talk more about kind of just the things that kind of led into you finally signing up?
Sure. Vietnam was what propelled me into the Marine Corps, into that side of the military, I should say. Like, my early childhood was all Air Force. But as I began to learn about the military and learn more about its especially its lower ranks and how it operated, but also its history and its lineage, the Air Force sort of began to kind of fall away in my interests. As I refer to it in the book as a very staid environment. Of all the services, look, the military in general terms is very much a 9-to-5 job on average. It's you just wear a uniform, but you go to an office or you go to a maintenance bay or what have you, and you just do a job for a number of hours and you go home. It just happens to have a component to it that sends you overseas sometimes. And that little attribute of it was somewhat uninteresting to me because I'd seen it. I was living it every day. And so as I got older, I started realizing that, I wanted a little bit more of the expeditionary nature of it, the adventurism, something Orwell might recognize, or probably in a more deleterious manner, Rudyard Kipling, out there on the edges of its empire, sort of, so to speak. I kind of had an interest in that. I initially wanted to join the Army. It was my initial inclination, somewhat against my family's wishes to a degree. And they kind of phoned in the process. They didn't really they didn't want to put me in the job I wanted, which was naturally infantry, and they kind of wanted to just rush me through the process and get me out the door, sort of a notch on the belt, so to speak. And I
remember you wrote, like, your grandfather said, "Do not let Jerad join the military." So there was some kind of like hesitation there, but you were also kind of like a military kid too, though, moving around base to base. Yeah. So I would say that atmosphere, you knew that lifestyle of the kind of a military atmosphere. Would you agree with that?
I did. My grandfather didn't want me to join the Army specifically.
Oh, okay. So
he had real beef with the Army, things he had seen, and so yeah, I'd been around it. My movement around the military was somewhat light in comparison to some other people. I remember, as a kid, we'd live on especially in Japan. I remember I lived in a military base there, and we had other kids there who had probably set foot in the United States just long enough to visit with grandparents. Like, they went on vacation to the U.S. and they were U.S. citizens. Their parents were in the military, but they just hopped around from one foreign posting to another. They would go from Greece to Turkey to Germany to Japan to Korea to, what have you, and then maybe land in the U.S. Sometime later on in their teenage years, or find themselves there as an adult, which is kind of startling. You have entire families that just kind of they're Americans, but they just live off in the edges of our military reach.
Right. You called it the U.S. Empire. You call it. It's
I do. I refer to it as a castle in the empire. I kind of use this interchangeably. Right. And so that was definitely an attribute that put me into the military, but really the stories of the soldiers are what put me into the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps, what was interesting about the Marine Corps specifically was they didn't look for me. I didn't get phone calls from the Marine recruiter. I had to call him. I had to find him, and he was a nice guy. We're still acquainted to this day. But his attitude was like, to be honest, like, why us? Why do you want to do this? Why, there's you can go do anything. I had good ASVAB scores. I could have gone into any of the services, and there were certainly a few that were clamming for me. I think the Air Force and the Navy were blowing my phone up even after I enlisted in the Marine Corps. Yeah, I had to kind of prove my interest to them, and that was, that just took it to another level. Now I have to prove my worth to this organization. That was obviously a recruiting tool. They have a need for live bodies, as they would say, just as much as any other military organization. They've just found a recruiting tactic that makes it a little bit more enticing to inclined people to want to join. It makes you more determined to want to become that.
It's kind of like a psychological kind of trick ploy, maybe.
A little bit, but I think it's just their nature too. I mean, even boot camp is that way. You might show up in the Army and be called a private or a soldier right up front. Well, you got to earn the right to be called a Marine. You have to go through that 3-month process. You go through recruit training, and then at the end of that, only then can you refer to yourself and be referred to as a Marine. And that drives a lot of the zealotry that recruits have when they enlist. And it's what drives some of their zealotry after they finish. That's now a title they have to live up to and maintain. That was attractive to me as a teenager.
Right, and that's kind of like the toughest of the 4 branches. Really, you guys are kind of like the front. I mean, you in the Army, I suppose, are probably the front. Shock troops to a certain extent. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think the Marine Corps' function is to knock down walls. I mean, that's what it does best. I mean, if we use Persian Gulf War as the example, its responsibility there was to breach mine and wire obstacles on the southern border of Kuwait, and which was the heaviest defended part of the Iraqi defense position. And in order to pin down their army, so the U.S. Army could do their big left hook. They were up against some, pretty high odds. It just happened that the Iraqi Army turned out not to be the fighting force they proclaimed to be. But they had arguably one of the toughest assignments in that conflict. And you look at the history of World War II. I mean, their job was effectively to land on opposed beaches. We talk a lot about D-Day, and that's certainly worthy of discussion, but the Marine Corps had been doing that probably for a year to 2 years prior to the Romy landings, with some ghastly results in certain cases.
And the Marines had really intense duties in Vietnam too. A lot of mobile. I had a guy on to discuss the Vietnam War with him, and he was kind of on a troop ship that would just send in, sweep, go back to the ship, sweep. Mm-hmm. Really incredible frontline duty.
I remember reading about those guys, the battalion landing teams. They would go, they would fly in and do things. But no, you're right. I mean, the U.S. Marines in Vietnam had, it was kind of double-headed in a sense, because on the one side of it, they were up against the demilitarized zone between South and North Vietnam, and they were also up against the infiltration routes coming out of Laos, and so they were basically in a place that they couldn't really fight back very well, and they were attriting their numbers. Their casualties were remarkably high, 67 and 68 in particular. Con Tien, the Siege of Con Tien, the Siege of Khe Sanh, Battle of Way City during Tet, the A Shaw Valley, like Leatherneck Square. It was just it was a nasty place to be a Marine.
And so what year was it that you ended up joining the Marines? What year was it?
It was the summer of 1998. I graduated high school, and 3 weeks later I was at Paris Island.
Gotcha. So then you got through, and did you feel like you had that kind of special elan of the Marines drilled into you, and that you were now kind of pretty much stamped as a Marine? Like all of those.
I don't think I'm the zealot, and to be frank, I really wasn't a zealot when I was in. And perhaps I'm priding myself a little bit too much on my self-awareness, or my ability to be aware of things. But I kind of had it's maybe a character flaw as it relates to the military, but I had an unhealthy way of seeing the contradictions. Sometimes organizations like that would profess a certain zealotry and then not demonstrate it on an individual level sometimes. At the end of the day, a military unit is a remarkably dysfunctional family. And how well they work together is an indicator of how well will dictate how well they succeed. But at the end of the day, it is a very clumsy kind of operation. It works well, but Sometimes on the lower enlisted level, it's a little bit, to use the slang, janky.
Right.
Now they are. That doesn't suggest that they're not professional. They are, but a lot of people. A good friend of mine calls it you had to have prison rules, which is a terrible way of stating it, but it does have a certain truth in that you had to have you had to kind of go in there with a certain attitude. It was a very much a job of image to a large degree. How well you looked was sometimes more important than how good a Marine you were in the field. And those things, it really stuck out to me sometimes, and it would chip away at my things that I would see, or chip away rather at my attitude toward it. At the end of the day, though, I mean, I'm proud to have been a U.S. Marine. I don't have any real regrets as far as joining the Marine Corps goes. I don't think it's fair to do that, because anybody who goes into the military, there's plenty of people who are willing to talk about the experience openly and honestly. That it's sometimes a little bit difficult for me to understand why people go into it with blinders. There's a lot of, just in the literature, and there are good films on it. One of the films that motivated me when I was a kid was Platoon. And that's a movie that's inherently anti-war and anti-military to a certain extent, and
Right.
But that motivated me to, and it motivated a lot of my friends too. We still quote that film in certain respects when we're talking about the military, but we're doing that because it was a dysfunctional organization, and we relate to it because that film demonstrated that really well. But so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, you want to talk about prison rules and rules of a group. Platoon, I think, shows that very well. Like totally different, different standards and who's running the show. Can you kind of talk about from being in the war, like 98, and how you moved into the war? Maybe you could share another of your stories if you don't mind reading a little more from your book.
Sure, I can do that. Here we go. This is a great one. Okay. This is in Iraq. I awake in the dirt with my rifle beside me. It is a clear night and cool, the kind bonfires and whiskey and good music grow from. I pull off my poncho liner and sit up. I'm next to the Humvee among a scattering of abandoned houses that look gray and worn. Corey and Boomhauer, an airborne Marine, are asleep next to me. A radio beeps and crackles from inside the command post. I've been awakened by a dog standing off to my left, maybe 10 feet away. Its snout is down, its eyes up in a question. It's a big dog in matted black fur, a big dog with matted black fur. Its ribs outlined by malnutrition. Dogs are the eternal common denominator at night. We can hear them in the canals and around the dikes of the fields that line the river and out in the desert, baying and howling into the darkness in packs, telegraphing our movements and general business to the kingdom we vie over. I once watched a squad of puppies burst from the desert and run down a length of Humvees on a road as we waited for a Black Hawk helicopter to evacuate a wounded Marine. The little dogs yapped and skipped around us, climbed up our legs with their front paws, and skittered away in glee, taking the ugly energy of the medevac with them. We love dogs because they remind us of dogs at home, but we are also afraid of dogs because of their hunger and disease. Sometimes we must shoot them. It is a wretched thing, and when we do, it feels as if we have betrayed ourselves. I grab my rifle and stand. The big black dog remains motionless. I do not know if it is sick or driven to some kind of madness from rabies. I do know that the others are asleep and I am awake, and I cannot have this dog bite one of them. I am on its land, and I am scared of it. It no doubt wants food, but I have none I am willing to share. It lifts its head and opens its jaw and pants easily. Then it closes it again and watches me, and I don't know if it's contemplating an attack or simply my intentions. It makes no sound. Take off, I whisper at it, but it does not move.
Right. So do you have those kind of memories? It's interesting. You have a real interest in Vietnam. Did you feel like after your experiences as a Marine, you kind of had those flashbacks or memories that may have haunted some of the people who were in Vietnam?
I don't think so. I think that I had a bit of I kind of came at it in reverse, weirdly enough. I sort of knew what I was getting into in Iraq before I went. Now, granted, the minutia and the details of combat, I had only vague understanding of, and some of the emotional impact of that, I can only sort of parrot from other people's experiences. But when I got back, it was I went back and I read a lot about Vietnam, but I don't think I had the same sort of feeling, at least not that I can tell. I may still need to mine that a little bit as an emotional sort of, maybe an emotional inventory of my experience there. But I don't think that I had a similar experience. I definitely got out of, I left the Marine Corps not long after that. But I don't think that I don't know that I would say my experiences compared. That said, I do know that I sought solace in their stories, in a large way, and that their stories kind of helped me sort of center myself a little bit, because the stories from Iraq hadn't really galvanized yet. It was still very early. I was there in 2005 and 2006, and it was still, we were still sort of trying to figure out what we were actually doing in this place. And there was only one book that had come out about it by that point. It was a book called The Last True Story I'll Ever Tell, by a fantastic writer named John Crawford. And otherwise, there just wasn't literature on it. There was very little. And so I kind of had to fall back on Vietnam as a kind of touchstone in a large way.
And how did you kind of adapt coming out of the military as somebody who was kind of a military associated person all the way up till 2006, I guess? What happened?
I think I adapted fairly well. At the end of the day, the military is made up of just people, and I think that one of the things I recognize is that while they might be, they might have some very organizational specific value sets. At the end of the day, they're just people. And this is one of the things I think that folks kind of miss about the military, is, especially civilians, strictly civilians, is that there's a kind of attitude that the military is something inherently separate and different, and those people are part of an entirely different class. But the reality is they're just us. Like, they're just people that we know, maybe know or don't know, but they're not really that different from us. They just decided to go off and do that work for a host of reasons. I always kind of laugh when folks tell me they could never, quote unquote, do that kind of work, or like they would never be able to survive the training. Like, well, the whole idea of the training is to create the individual that would survive the training. It's very much it is a kind of tear down and rebuild sort of operation. You will survive that work, and many tens of thousands of people come and go from the military every year, and that those are us. We do these things.
It's the Full Metal Jacket induction. And what did you do when you wrote this book, when it was done, giving you a kind of an overview of your life? What did you have any takeaways from it once you finished it?
I think the biggest thing for me was the book. It does address a little bit of like the moral complexity of warfare, and being in war. And I've been asked recently, have I taken a more absolutist position? And I've said no. I said, in fact, I want to live with the contradictions. I want to stay in that center line and be able to have two opposing points of view in my head and still function effectively. I want to be able to explore the people, the attitude, our attitudes about war that are, quite frankly, pro-war, and I want to be able to explore the attitudes that are anti-war, because I think you need both of them. You need to be able to analyze both of them concurrently to be able to understand what war is. And those are things that what the book has done for me and writing it is just defined my position, I suppose, and sort of helped me have some organizing questions when I discuss that subject. And if I go forward and continue to write about it, those are some things I really want to evaluate.
Right. Because, it is kind of a contradictory thing to be there in the military and then go back. What's your position on the kind of you were involved in a lot of those earlier the war started 2003. you were there 2005 and 6. There were still some pretty intense operations taking place in Iraq, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, it was second to maybe the surge in 07. It was probably one of the bloodiest years there. It was very violent. 2005 and 6 were stunningly violent. I mean, well, basically, if you go from the first Battle of Fallujah in the spring of 04 to probably 2000 late 6, I mean, you're looking at a really nasty period in that war. The Iraqi army was dissolved, which was a foolish decision, and then they tried to rebuild a new one, and that gave an insurgency time to galvanize around a cause and to sort of basically grow itself. And of course, our own sort of clumsy, ham-fisted Western way of handling that country, sort of added to that, and it produced some incredibly intense battles. Battle of Fallujah, the fighting in the upper Euphrates River Valley, near the Syrian border, which is where I was. There was 4 operations run up there in a year, killed quite a few people. The Battle of Ramadi, the fighting in Ramadi and Haditha. That's just on the Marine Corps side of things. And the Army's obviously got its litany of engagements and battles that occur elsewhere. It was a rough place to be.
Do you feel fortunate? I mean, did you have any severe or serious injuries? Like, because some people came out of there either obviously didn't make it or lots of injuries out of that time, right? IEDs and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Thankfully, no. I was not wounded. I had my brushes with, I had some close calls with that. But I cannot tell you how grateful I am that I was not hit, or that I was hit. That I wasn't hit, rather. And I think when I think back on that, that is the one thing I think back on it now and I'm almost reckless. I think it was a reckless decision in a lot of ways to go over there. But at the same time, I'm glad I did it. But yeah, I am just, knees on the earth, grateful that I did not get hit.
Because you write about people who didn't make it in your group. Yeah. What else would you like to add? I mean, we're about almost at 35 minutes. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I'd missed, or what would you like to leave the listener before we wrap this up?
I guess a couple of small things. One thing I would just ask the reader is to evaluate their own understanding of the military and war in general terms. Like we sent our soldiers to Iraq and Afghanistan. As a voting bloc, we have decided that these things were important to us until they weren't. And then we just kind of allowed them to kind of sustain themselves, as a sort of a political third rail. And I would ask the reader, anybody who's listening and the reader, to just evaluate that with themselves. Why did we allow a war to go on 20 years? That's something that needs to be addressed. And there's a lot of moral quandary in that decision, or lack of decision in a lot of respects. That's definitely one thing. That's something I really would love to see the reader sort of engage with.
What are your thoughts on this, on Afghanistan, as somebody who's been over there? What are your thoughts about that whole situation?
Well, I didn't go to Afghanistan, but my attitude on it is, I'll say this: a lot of people were very upset about the clumsy withdrawal, and my mentality about it was, if we sort of flown in our policies about Afghanistan for a long time. And if that's true, there was no way the evacuation was going to somehow go up against that grain. It was going to be just as clumsy as the war we elected to fight in. It did not surprise me that it went the way that it did. It's a tough, evacuating in a country is a tough maneuver to pull off in optimal conditions. It's going to be even worse when you're kind of just trying to get away from it because you're sick of thinking about it.
And Jerad, where's the best place for somebody to obtain volunteers? Get the book.
I think the best place, honestly, is an independent bookseller. Find a local indie place and pick it up there. You can also go to bookshop.org and pick it up. If you can also find it through my website at jeradalexander.com. Those are three preferred ways to do that.
And you have an audiobook of this too, right?
I do. So it's the audiobook was released at the same time as the hardback and the Kindle edition as well. So
it just got released. So all this stuff is within the last week too, right? So you dropped dropped a hardback, audio, and Kindle, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it was released. It came out last Tuesday.
And if somebody wants to reach out to you, is the best place through your website, jaredalexander.com?
They can do it through the website. They can also reach me at Jared_Alexander at Twitter. That's my Twitter handle.
Great. And again, the title of the book is Volunteers: Growing Up in the Forever War by Jerad W. Alexander, just published November 9th, 2021. Thank you so much for your time, Jerad.
Thank you.
All right, take care. All right, stay there. Stay there.